Gemara here. We've been discussing the laws of who can be joined into a zimun or to a minyan. And we're talking about here including a child. And one of the things we mentioned yesterday was that I believe Sephardic people do include a child at a certain age to join a zimun. It's not done in the Ashkenazic community, but it is done, if I'm correct, it is done in the Sephardic community. And it's based on this Gemara here. And our Gemara here goes through a lot of leniencies with including people to a zimun. The initial statement of the Gemara was that a koton hamutol ba'arisa, which is a child who's in a cradle, you could do a zimun with. And on that, the Gemara said, how could that be? There's a Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Ein mezamnin aleihen, you don't do a zimun. And the Gemara answered that there's the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi that says that he could join to a zimun of 10. So you can't create a zimun. He can't create a zimun, this child who's in a cradle, but he could join to a zimun if there is a zimun already. In other words, if there's already a zimun of 3, let's say there's nine people, so they already have their own, they already have a zimun, because once you have more than 3, that's already a zimun. So this child is able to allow you to add on the benefit of having a 10 people zimun. And even though he's only a child, he didn't have his bar mitzvah yet, but the v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael, you could sanctify Hashem's name because there is 10 people, and it's not considered a embarrassment to the Shechina. In other words, normally we don't include children because it's like you're making a minyan of children. It's like it's not honorable to the Shechina. But here it's only 1, so you have 9 already of, and you're just using this one child as a sniff to 10 as a addition, as a attachment to the 10. That is acceptable for the zimun. At least that's the initial statement of the Gemara. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say it bothered me the first time I saw it that I know that a child in his cradle is not really fully developed. His brain is not even fully developed. How can you, if you said a child, okay, but a child in a cradle may be too young for me to add
Right.
to a minyan.
Right. So we're not really saying that you could join him for a regular minyan, but for a zimun, where zimun really only needs 3, so and you have 3 men, so all you're adding is like an enhanced zimun. You're making an enhanced zimun by having him counted as the 10, and on this, at least Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says is acceptable, and that's what the Gemara understands. Rav Asi is saying that katan muto ba'arisa, that he's referring to what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, which is that he could complete the 10 people zimun.
Well, actually, it's kosher with or without him, so maybe that's the reason.
It's kosher with or without him. However, you are adding, this is an enhanced zimun. You're adding Hashem's name.
It. Yeah.
You're adding Elokeinu. So you're adding something new, but it's but the way the Gemara is understanding it is, since you already have a zimun without him, so he's only enhancing it. He's not really making the zimun into a zimun. He's just enhancing it. That's sort of how it's explained.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the Gemara continued, and it mentioned that if you have 9 people and an eved and a slave, they could join together for a zimun or for a minyan. And this is a very interesting Gemara because it mentions that Rabbi Eliezer came to Shul, and there was no minyan there. And because there was no minyan there, he decided to free his slave. Now, why did he free his slave? According to the statement of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, you don't need to free the slave. You could count the slave in for the zimun. The slave could be counted in for the minyan. Why do you have to free him? Freeing a slave is a very expensive way of making a minyan. It's extremely expensive. I don't know how much it used to cost for a slave, but I could just imagine that it must be a huge amount of money to buy a slave. And then just to go free him would be, it's why do you have to do that? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says you're allowed to count a slave. If you have 9, count a slave for the 10th. So the Gemara has to answer that it must be that they really needed 2 people. And 1 slave you can count, but 2 slaves you can't count. And therefore they needed 2 people. So 1 slave he freed, and the other slave, he kept him a slave. And that's how he was able to have a minyan. Now, what is interesting, one of the interesting things about this Gemara is that there is a discussion in the Shilas Tshuvas, one of the halachic rendering books, where the people would ask great rabbis hard questions. And one of the questions that's asked over there is, if a person creates a goylam, a person creates from the book of Sefer Yetzirah, uses the book of formations, which is a Kabbalistic book. If you're a scholar of Kabbalah and you know how to make a golem, what would happen if you made a golem? Would you be able to count the golem in for a minyan? And this is no joke. This is a serious question. Now, on the one hand, you would say that maybe he's not really a person. He's not Jewish. But on the other hand, it says that the person who's megadol yosem b'seich beisai, a person who brings up an orphan in his house, it's as if he gave birth to him. There are some sources that would imply like it is your child, and maybe you would be able to include. And he asks this as a very serious question. It goes back and forth. Now, one of the commentaries on this, one of the later rabbis says, we have a proof from our Gemara that you cannot count the golem for a minyan. What's the proof? The proof is that why did Rabbi Eliezer free his slave? He could have just created a golem from the book of Yetzirah. He could have taken a Sefer Yetzirah, figured out, he knew it. He knew it inside out. Rabbi Eliezer was a great Kabbalist. In fact, they say that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai got his Kabbalah ultimately from Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer got it from Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Eliezer was a great makubal. And he could have easily created a golem. And so the fact that he didn't create a golem and instead he freed his slave, it must be that a golem is not counted for a minyan. Anyway, it's interesting. You would think that this is a joke, this question, but it is discussed. It's interestingly discussed. I didn't see it in the source, but it's mentioned. I know I think it's in the what did I say? Chacham Tzvi, the Shal Shuvas Chacham Tzvi. Let's see, Ezra, yes.
Wouldn't it be a problem with the golem? I mean, you have to have an individual that has a free will.
Listen, I'm also very surprised. I have to look it up and find this how he creates the question out of this. It definitely seems a little surprising to me. I mean, I mean, what they're saying is he's creating a golem who's actually human. He has he's creating a human. I don't know what that really means. In other words, we're not talking about going to a carpenter and making a golem. We're talking about using the book of Yetzirah and creating a golem. So it has, I guess, as you're considering this person to be, so you created a person Maybe he has free will. I don't know. It definitely seems a little surprising, but yes, Ben.
They say the Rabbi of Prague made a
Right.
golem that saved the city or saved the.
Yeah, for sure. Right, and supposedly it wasn't the only one. There might have been other.
That's the only one I
creations.
know. So.
Right.
Yeah, Rabbi Louis, Loewe, I think
Yeah.
was the.
Yeah, that's who Ben is talking about, Rabbi Lowe.
Yeah.
Maharal.
Yeah.
Yes, Susan. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you tell me where it says in the Torah that we're allowed to have slaves? And the words, what is the word slave in Hebrew?
Eved.
So slave doesn't mean that you force someone into being slave. It means that someone sells himself as a slave. So it has a different meaning than the southern. I know we live in Florida, but the different meaning than the way the slaves were sold and
Like an indentured servant, is that what you mean? Indentured servant?
I don't know the difference, but Isaac seems to be saying yes. So I guess that's the correct translation.
I mean, it's one form of it. Slavery is a very broad term, but an indentured servant would be one. I wouldn't say a sharecropper because that works on the land. That has no personal slavery. But you could have situations where you, like the rabbi just said, you sell yourself for a number of years to somebody to do what he needs, and you get paid for that.
You're getting free room and board, basically. It has to do with someone who doesn't want to have to deal with any bills in their life, and they basically get their room and board. They never have to worry about food, and they never have to worry about a bed, and they're all set. Now, is that a good life? Not for a Jew, but it could be for someone else.
A live-in butler or a live-in maid. I mean, we think of slavery, we immediately think of whips and chains and beatings, but it doesn't have to be like that.
But at the same time, this is not ideal way of living. But that some people did that. They sold themselves as slaves. Though you know.
Okay, what is the Hebrew word for slave?
Eved. Eved. Okay, Ezra. Yes.
But again, Isaac, someone who's a butler or even a maid, in our day, can basically pick up and leave anytime that they want. And Eved didn't have that choice. They were indentured to work.
I don't know if they can pick up and leave whenever
they can give their 2 weeks notice and they're gone.
I don't know that, and neither do you. Back then, how they did things, we have 2 weeks notice and we walk in and out.
Listen, the other aspect is that if the guy who had the butler or whatever it is was not happy with them, he could fire them. He didn't have to give them, for example, for an Eved Kanani, he didn't have to give him a shtar shechur or anything like that.
Right.
It's a different situation.
He
It's
could
a different
sell that
situation.
by selling their contract. The other person would now own them.
But let me ask you.
In any event, I think we've clarified the idea. Thank you, Isaac, for clarifying, and Ezra.
Sorry.
Giving a little more understanding of what a slave was. Of course, we don't know. We're not familiar with this idea because we don't have such things nowadays.
And slave is a big word. That's the problem. It has all kinds of negative connotations.
Right.
But we deal with Avadim in Yiddishkeit and Judaism all the time. It's a form of contractual labor, if you want. You signed up for a year.
We call ourselves slaves to Hashem.
The thing is that the common slave, I don't know that it was really for a time, Isaac. Generally, the understanding is that they sell their guf. Their guf is kanui loy. You buy their body, and it's basically a lifetime agreement that they sell themselves to you.
Well, an Eved Ivri is 6 years.
An Eved Kanani, I know, but we're talking about an Eved Kanani.
All right.
So an Eved Kanani, and he becomes Jewish when he does this. So it seems, so it definitely, the understanding is in it, and you're supposed to inherit this to your child. So even if the owner passes away, the slave becomes owned by the child, and his children are also slaves. They have the rule of slaves, and there's laws about them. In fact, who they're allowed to marry and so on, because they're actually Jewish, but they're fall into a category of slaves. And that is there are laws about it in Jewish laws. A lot of laws about it, how you have to treat them and so on. Yes, Ben.
Yeah, we are all slaves of God, and nobody's complaining about it.
This is the greatest. This is the greatest gift that we have, that we could be Hashem's slave.
He told us, "You'll be my slave."
Except that we use a different term. We don't use the word slave. We use the word servant.
Well, avodai.
Yeah, but in the
it does say avodai.
We translate it as a servant of Hashem. We don't call ourselves a slave. I mean, there's a very big difference between the two. Slave means that, you don't have, you may not want to do it, whereas as a servant, you want to do it. You love to do it.
Yes.
But there are times that we have to force ourselves. So it does maybe carry with it that responsibility of a slave as well, that we sometimes have to go against our desire, if we're not in the mood, I should say. Okay, so in any event, now we've had some lesson about Eved, and I guess in connection to Shavuos, that Hashem chose us for his people, and we became his people on Har Sinai. Avodaihim v'lo avodim la'avodim, we're slaves to Hashem and not to anyone else, which is a very powerful idea, that we should not feel ourselves obligated to do anything but only to Hashem. Anyway, so bottom line is the Rabbi Eliezer could have created a golem, and he didn't create a golem. And we see from here that a golem would not be able to be counted for a minyan, but instead he had to free one of his slaves, and the other slave could be counted as number 10. So the number 9 was the slave that he had to free, and he became Jewish. When a slave is a slave, he's obligated in mitzvahs like a woman, so therefore he can't be counted for a minyan, just like a woman is not counted for a minyan. When he's freed, he actually becomes a regular Jew, and at that point he is at that point he becomes a regular Jew. He can be counted for a minyan, and the other slave would be number 10, and that would be acceptable. Now, the Gemara continues here and says that...
Rabbi, question.
Yeah.
The reason why the 10th one is because we use the rule that 9 is like 10.
That's what it seems like, that only for the 10th. That's what the Gemara is understanding, that only for a 10th you could count him. And it seems like it's going on that, basing itself on that idea that 9 is like, that it looks like 10. Now, of course, we know that the halacha doesn't follow these rules, but this is as we saw later in the Gemara. Gemara says that the halacha doesn't go like all of these statements. Now, the Gemara continued and asked some questions on this whole story, because it is a very surprising thing. You don't have a minyan, so you're going to go and free a slave. Now, to us, the way I mentioned it, it sounds like he's just spending a lot of money on a mitzvah, right? He's getting a minyan, and he's losing his slave. So it sounds like maybe a very expensive investment over here, where he's getting one minyan. I mean, we don't know what the guy's going to do afterwards. At least he'll stay for this minyan. But in other words, it's not like you have a guaranteed minyan for the rest of your life because you freed the slave. Who knows? You might go live somewhere else, but at least now you have your minyan. So you're getting your mitzvah, your one minyan, and you freed your slave. You got your minyan. The big problem is not the financial aspect. It's the fact that the Torah says that li'olam bahem ta'avodu, forever they should work for you, which means that there's an argument. really there's an argument how to translate these words in the Gemara. The Gemara has an argument. What does it mean? Le'olam bahem ta'avodu. Forever they will have to serve you. Does it mean it's a mitzvah that they should serve you forever? Or does it mean that you can have them serve you forever? So according to the opinion that it means in other words, you're allowed to free them, but you can, if you don't free them, then they serve you forever. Or is it a mitzvah that they have to serve you forever because you're not allowed to free them? Is it a prohibition on freeing a slave? And the Gemara concludes, the conclusion of the Gemara is that it is a prohibition, because we follow that opinion, Rabbi Akiva against Rabbi Yishmael. There's the two opinions in the Gemara in Saita, that if you're allowed to free a slave, is it rishus or is it chayva? Lo'elam behem ta'avodu. Is it something that you're allowed to have them work for you forever, or is it you're obligated to have them work for you forever? So the conclusion is that it's a mitzvah that they're supposed to work for you forever, and as a prohibition, if you don't, you're transgressing this positive commandment. So what are you going to tell me, that we should free the slave, transgress a positive commandment in order to make a minyan? Now, what mitzvah is minyan? Most opinions hold the minyan is only a rabbinic commandment. So you're going to want to fulfill a mitzvah of minyan. And so what do? You transgress a positive biblical obligation? That does sound a little surprising. Now, now I'm adding to the question. The Gemara's question really is that there's a prohibition, lo'elam behem ta'avodu. So how are you going to think that you're going to do a mitzvah of a minyan, and it's a mitzvah haba ba'avera? You're doing a mitzvah and sinning. I'm adding to the question of the Gemara, and I'm saying not only is you're doing a mitzvah haba ba'avera, you're doing a sin while you're doing this mitzvah. You're getting your minyan and you're doing a sin. I'm adding, by the way, keep in mind that this mitzvah is seemingly rabbinic. So it definitely seems very surprising that you're going to be allowed to do this. But anyway, the Gemara asks this question as in the commentaries add the additional question that I'm adding to it. But the way the Gemara asks the question, the Gemara says that they're supposed to work for you forever. It's a positive commandment that you're not allowed to free a slave. And how could Rabbi Eliezer free a slave to do a mitzvah? That's called how can he do that? First, the Gemara says it's a prohibition. You're not allowed to free a slave. The Gemara answers it's for a mitzvah. Then the Gemara says, what do you mean? It's a mitzvah ba'avera. This is a mitzvah that's connected to avera. The Gemara answers, no, it's a mitzvah for communal needs. It's a communal mitzvah. So the question really is, so how does that work? If it's a communal mitzvah, does that allow you to transgress a positive commandment? And not only that, but I'm adding that it seems seemingly rabbinic. But the Gemara doesn't deal with the rabbinic part, and the Gemara just seems to first is surprised that you're going to transgress. Then it says, well, you're doing it for a mitzvah, and then the Gemara says, well, it's a mitzvah that comes with an avera, so it shouldn't work, even though you're doing it for a mitzvah, it shouldn't work. And the Gemara answers, no, it does work because it's called a mitzvah derabim. It's a mitzvah of communal need, and therefore it should be acceptable. And because it's for communal need. Now, what does it mean for communal benefit? What is a communal benefit of this mitzvah of minyan? Well, so when you daven with the minyan, so everyone, the whole community, all the people are getting a benefit. The mitzvah of lo'elam behem ta'avodu, that you have to keep the slave, that's an individual mitzvah for you to fulfill. But here, everyone fulfills the mitzvah of sanctifying God's name in public, and therefore the Gemara is explaining that this mitzvah derabim, it's a mitzvah for the public. Therefore, it should be allowed. Therefore, the Rabbi Eliezer was allowed to do what he did, and he freed his slave for this minyan in his local shul. So that's the Gemara's that's the statement from the Gemara. Now, to answer the question that I asked, Oh, 1 second. To answer the question that I asked, that it's a rabbinic mitzvah, so the understanding is that one way of explaining it is that the mitzvah of keeping a slave forever is a mitzvah connected to the idea that you're not supposed to give a matnas chinam, not supposed to give a free gift to a non-Jew. There's a prohibition of giving a matnas chinam, a free gift. The Torah says lo sechanim. Generally, this applied to like idol worshippers and so on, that you weren't allowed to give a free gift, lo sechanim. That prohibition, lo sechanim, it has a number of meanings. One of them is you're not allowed to sell them a piece of property in Eretz Yisrael. Lo sechanim, lo sitin lahem chanoya ba'aretz. You shouldn't. And so there's a prohibition of giving them a matnas chinam, a free gift. So that prohibition applies if you're not getting something for it. In other words, you're allowed to sell something to a non-Jew, but you wouldn't be allowed to give a matnas chinam. Now, different rules about this. Of course, generally when you give a gift, you're expecting something in return, right? That's generally why you give a free gift. You're expecting something in return, so it's not always considered like a free gift. But if you give a real free gift, that could be problematic. If you're expecting to get a benefit from it, so then it's not called a free gift. You're really like expecting something. You're going to benefit. They're going to help you out when you need their help and so on. But this is it could be that's according to one opinion, that's the reason why you're not allowed to free a slave, because then you're like giving them a free gift. You're letting him have freedom, and therefore here you're benefiting from it because you're getting a mitzvah. You're doing it for a mitzvah, so then it's not called a free gift. You're getting something for it. So even if it's rabbinic, but you're getting something for it, so therefore it's not considered a problem. You would be allowed to free a slave for this reason, and that's seemingly the way he understands the Gemara, which is a little problematic. It doesn't exactly flow with the Gemara. The Gemara doesn't say because you're benefiting. The Gemara does say it initially says that it's a mitzvah, so that you could explain. The mitzvah, the mitzvah is that worth. It's not free. It's for a mitzvah. But then the Gemara asks, the mitzvah b'avera. It's not really a mitzvah b'avera because it's not a free gift. So then you could argue, and so the Gemara, the continuation of the Gemara doesn't exactly flow with this explanation, but there are other explanations. Another explanation is that it says that when Hashem comes to a shul and there's no minyan, it says Hashem is angry. Miyad koyes. That's a Gemara that we learned earlier on page 6, that if he doesn't find 10 people there, Hashem comes to the shul and he doesn't find 10 people there, he gets angry. And the Gemara brings a verse from Isaiah, why have I come? And there's no one that answers. And the honor of the Shechina overrides this mitzvah of La'olam Bahem Ta'avodim. So that answer is also a little interesting, that, in other words, there's a mitzvah to obligation to not free a slave. And there's also, of course, we want to honor the Shechina. So what is the Gemara really explaining? That you would be allowed to transgress one in order to honor the Shechina. Where do we find that? In other words, that's also a little surprising to explain. In other words, that deserves explanation. How are you going to explain that? We don't generally judge which mitzvah is more important than another one and say, well, this can override that. There are some rules about it, that say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment in certain scenarios, but to just say that to honor the Shechina is going to override the mitzvah of La'olam Behem Ta'avodu, that you have to keep this slave as a slave, it definitely is a surprising answer as well. So then there's another answer that the law of la'ila behem ta'avodu is not applicable to everyone. Meaning, if you don't have a slave, you have no mitzvah. So it doesn't carry with it the same. It's considered a lenient mitzvah. It's a light mitzvah, and therefore, when you have a mitzvah of tefillah b'tzibur, a mitzvah of davening with a minyan, that's applicable to every yid. So therefore, that would override such a mitzvah. Again, these are complicated answers, but the rabbis are trying to understand this and how to understand what the exemption is. But somehow you're allowed. Rabbi Eliezer was allowed to do this, to free a slave. All these answers really deserve more insight. In fact, even the final, there is another answer that they give, that the obligation of la'ilam behem ta'avodu is not biblical. It's only rabbinic. So it could be that it is only a rabbinic obligation of based on that verse. So, but that also is a little interesting, because what's the argument of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel if it's a chayva or a rishus, if it's only rabbinic? In other words, they're saying that it's even rabbinically there's an argument. They're arguing about a rabbinic relying on that verse. But bottom line is that this is the Gemara here implies that it is acceptable to free a slave. If any of you have any slaves and they don't have a minyan, it does seem acceptable that you could free a slave. The Gemara does not retract from this, so it does seem acceptable to free a slave in order to make someone counted for a minyan. Now, the next Gemara talked about a person going early to shul and to be able to be counted. It's also commonly known Gemara that that's very special thing to be from the first 10. And to be counted from the first 10, you get the merit of everyone else. What it seems the understanding is that because you're from the first 10, you are the one who caused the Shekhinah, the divine presence, to be there. So you brought the divine presence there, therefore you get a special merit, and everyone else is just participating, but you actually brought the Shekhinah. So because you brought the Shekhinah, therefore you get the reward of everyone else who came. You are the one who brought the Shekhinah there. And the Gemara is surprised that you get their reward also, and they don't get any reward. That can't be. The Gemara says, no, you get the reward either greater than theirs, or depending on how many people that come, you get reward for each person that comes. And what it seems like the understanding is that because you are the one who brought the Shekhinah there, and each person that comes is more honor for the Shekhinah, is participating in it. So therefore, you're getting the merit of each person. Of course, they get their own merit, but you also get extra merit at each person that comes afterwards, because you're the one who brought the Shekhinah there to this great honor for the Shekhinah. Now,
does the 10th get even more because that's the person that actually makes the minyan?
So our Gemara doesn't say it so clearly. A lot of people think that maybe it's true. Maybe there's another Gemara, or maybe there's another interpretation of our Gemara. But at least from the way the Gemara says it, if you look at the Gemara, it says Kadei sheyizge v'yibne im asara harishonim, to be part of the first 10. So if you look at the wording, it doesn't exactly emphasize the 10th. Now, maybe there's another Gemara that emphasizes the 10th person, but from this Gemara, it doesn't seem to emphasize that. Now, the next Gemara talked about 9 people plus the Aron. You have the ark. So Rav Huna said 9 in the ark is considered for a minyan, or for zimun, or for davening. It's considered like a minyan. So the Gemara asked, what do you mean? The ark is not a person, it's not a human. So the Gemara answered, no, we mean 9 that looks like 10. That so of course all the commentaries say, so why did he say the ark? Right? Why was he emphasizing the ark if he really meant just that 9 that looks like 10 is good enough? And the Gemara explained what the 9 that looks like 10, it either means that they're pushed together or they're spread out, but somehow it implies, it seems like there's 10, then it should be that if 9 looks like 10, then that is counted like a minion. So why did he say in the ark? So the understanding is, one of the explanations is that the ark, it says, was Eina min Hamida. It did not take up space. The ark, in the Beis Hamikdash, if you measured from the ark to the wall, and you measured from one side of the ark to the one wall and one side of the ark to the other wall, you would always find, it would seem like the ark itself did not take up space. So for example, if in the Mishkan, the Mishkan was 10 amos from side to side, and basically it was 20 amos from side to side. If you counted from the ark to the wall and from the other side of the ark to the wall, you would have that full measurement. And so the ark itself, it says, was such a holy item that it was like beyond time. It was beyond space. It was within space, but beyond space. It had its own measurements, but at the same time, it was beyond space. So the same thing is that the same thing is just like the ark was beyond space. So 9 people, they are considered like 10 because it's so to speak similar to the ark, that it did not take up space, that it looked like it was there, but it wasn't really there. So the same thing is that 9 that looked like 10 doesn't need to be physically there. As long as it seems like it's 10, that's good enough. So in other words, similar to the ark, that it looked like it was there and it wasn't exactly there. So you have, it looks like there's 10, but it's not exactly 10. That's acceptable. So he was giving this similar idea to the ark. It's an interesting way of explaining it. There are other explanations. If you think about it, the ark itself was three pieces, because it was wood covered with gold. So you had a box of gold. You had, in other words, a box, what I mean is 4 walls and a bottom. You had a box of gold on the bottom. And the way it worked was that the bottom box went all the way up, the walls of it went all the way up 10 tfachim. The next box was a wooden box that was put inside, because it had to be covered with gold. It was wood covered with gold. That box only went up 9 tfachim high, walls. And then the inner box was gold, and it was also 4 walls and a bottom, and it went inside the wooden box, and it covered the entire wooden box. And that was also 9 tfachim on the sides. It's called in the Chumash, it's called tefach. Tefach, and it's called the amma v'chitzi. Amma v'chitzi kaimasai, it says. An amma and a half. An amma is 6 tfachim. So an amma and a half would be 9 tfachim. So the only box of the 3 boxes that was 10 tfachim high was the outer box. The inner boxes were 9 tfachim high because they had a tefach thick bar of gold called the kapiris. That was the top cover. Now the outer box went all the way to the top of that top cover. So the inner boxes were 1 tefach smaller than the outer box, because the inner boxes, if you calculate it, the inner boxes were 9 tefachim, and the outer box was 10 tefachim high. here you have the 9 and 10. What it says is that the external looked like it's 10, but really the main the internal boxes were only 9. So you see, there's like the Aron that's 9, but it looks like 10 because if you include the cover, the external box looks like it is 10. So 9 that looks like 10 is good enough. So that you see from the ark as well, that you have a case of 9 that looks like 10. And there's also another shot. Va'arain stands for the word va'arain. 9 va'arain stands for the echad raya ve'enoi nira. One that can see, or that seems like he's there, but he's not. Or that the echad raya ve'enoi nira. It seems, it seems like there's 10, but he's not really there. And that's what Rav Huna meant when he said va'arain, 9 in the ark. But ultimately, he had to explain himself because Rav Nachman couldn't understand what you're talking about. The ark is not a human. So he said, no, I mean like the ark, similar to the ark, or with this Rosh Tevas, Vechad Raya Ve'ena Nira, however you want to learn it. But ultimately, what he meant was that 9 itself should be good enough. Then the Gemara says that Rav Ami says that you have, for a Zimun, you have 2 plus Shabbos is good enough. So the Gemara says, Shabbos a human, Shabbos is not a person. The Gemara answered, no, you have 2 scholars that are talking in halacha, they could join together for a zimun. So the question is, what does that mean? Why did he say Shabbos if he meant that there's 2 scholars that are speaking halacha together? They're sharpening each other in halacha and learning. So what is it? Why did he say Shabbos? So one shot is he was hinting again. These are words of the rabbis that they speak in cryptic, in riddle form. He says in Shabbos, meaning Shabbos means scholars. That there are two scholars. They could join together. That's the simple understanding that Shabbos refers to scholars. But there is an explanation that the Shabbos stands for Ushnehem B'nei Torah. If you have 2 scholars, Shnayim, and the Vishabbos is Vavshin is Ushnehem, and both of them, the base is B'nei and the Tuf is Torah. That if you have Ushnehem B'nei Torah, both of them are scholars, then they could join together for a Zimun. And what the Gemara is saying is that you could have 2 people to be considered like a Zimun. And how does it work? Because the Torah is considered like the third person. Now the question is, just like Shabbos is not a human, the Gemara should have asked, what about the Torah? The Torah is also not a human, right? So that seems to be a question on the simple understanding of the Gemara. The Gemara wants to initially say 2 people. If it's Shabbos, you could join together and do a zimun, 2 people, because you have Shabbos. The Gemara answers, no, we're not talking about the Shabbos. We're talking about the scholars and they're learning Torah. So learning Torah, that's considered like 3 people. What do you mean? So in the learning Torah is a human, but the Torah is also not a human, right? But the Gemara doesn't ask that. So the Meiri says there must be a different shot in the Gemara. The different shot in the Gemara that he wants to learn is that it's really 3 people sitting together. 2 of them are eating. The third one's not eating. He's just studying Torah. And he's mechaded. So you have 2 people in Shnei Talmidei Chachamim, ha-mechadin zeh zeh b'halacha, and there's a third one that's, if they're speaking and learning, they're eating. The 2 Talmidei Chachamim are eating, and they're mechaded together in halacha with the third one. So that person could be mitzdarif to make it 3, because you have a third person now. If you're talking about Shabbos, it's not a third person there. But if you're talking about halacha, you're talking about that there's another person speaking with them and learning. They mechaded each other in halacha because there's a third person as well who's involved. Therefore, that would be considered like a zimun. That's the way the Meiri wants to learn. Okay, so then anyway, again, these Gemaras, they're interesting Gemaras because we don't really follow follow these leniencies, but there's definitely a lot to learn. I do want to mention that the Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, was it Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid? One of the commentaries, let me just see who it is. He mentions that Adayon Sarich Biur, Rav Hai Goyin. Rav Hai Goyin brings that the halacha doesn't follow these opinions, and Hasugya Tzarech Adayon Biur. The sugya still needs it's hard to understand the gemaras. Like they're a little unclear what was really going on. What were the rabbis really thinking that they wanted to rely on these leniencies? Okay, so the Gemara continues and says, Rabbi Yochanan says, a katan pereach is mezamnino. A katan pereach, I translated it according to Rashi. Rashi translates this to mean that a child who is not 13 yet, but he does have the 2 hairs, he could join for a zimun. He has 2 pubic hairs. According to the Jewish law of what is adulthood, maturity, and we generally say that if a child reaches 13, so we assume he has 2 pubic hairs and he is considered an adult. But we don't always assume that. There are issues like on biblical laws, you sort of have to be sure that the child is an adult. And just knowing his passport says he's 13, that's not really a proof that he's reached adulthood, because we don't know if he really has the 2 pubic hairs. So sometimes some areas of halacha, we question if we can have them fulfill the mitzvah for other people if he just turned 13. So for example, let's say his bar mitzvah is on Shabbos that they read Parshas Zachor. Parshas Zachor is read right before Purim, and that reading is, according to many opinions, is considered biblical. Now, the child says, I want to read the Torah, right? He wants to read the Torah for his bar mitzvah parsha. And the only thing is, if he reads the Torah for his bar mitzvah parsha, this actual Torah reading is actually a biblical Torah reading. And there could be an issue with the fact that he's reading this Torah reading and he's just turning 13, and we don't know if he really grew 2 pubic hairs. So, and most rabbis are not interested in checking. And therefore, the common way of dealing with this is you normally don't have him read that part. You have him read maybe the other Torah portion of the week. And then when it comes to the final reading called the Parsha Zachor part, you have maybe the rabbi or Bal Kaira, someone who's older, you have him read the rest of the that part that's considered biblical. And why would you do that? Because we don't know for sure that this child has reached adulthood, and therefore we would say let someone else exempt the congregation with the reading of this biblical reading. Now, in our Gemara, we're dealing with a child who's not 13 even. We're dealing with a child who's not 13, but he has 2 pubic hairs. Now, in regular laws, we don't include this child and say he's an adult because he has 2 pubic hairs. Normally, we would say pubic hairs before the age of 13 are not a sign of adulthood. They're really just some type of a growth, or sometimes you have some pimple that grows a hair or something. It's like a pimple that he grew a hair. It's not a sign of adulthood because he's before the age of 13. Normally, the pubic hairs are only considered adulthood if he reached the age of 13. However, here we're seeing a leniency that this child, according to the way Rashi's learning, is he's not 13, but we're going to count those pubic hairs to be considered a sign of at least adulthood for Zimun purposes. So for the Zimun, we're going to allow that. We're going to say that this is what Rabbi Yochanan seems to be saying, according to the way Rashi's learning, that a katan that's pereach, that he has these hairs growing, so mezamnan olav, you can do a Zimun with him. And then the Gemara brought a brisa that a katan that brought 2 cyrus, if he grew 2 these pubic hairs, you could do a Zimun with him. If he didn't bring those 2 hairs and he's a child, you can't do a Zimun with him. Now, then the brisa said a little problematic statement. And then it said, we don't check a child. And the question is, which implies like maybe you don't even need the 2 hairs. Maybe you could include a child anyway. We don't check, we don't care, we're not worried about a child. We're not so careful about a child. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? First, you say you need to have the 2 pubic hairs, and then you say we don't care. So the Gemara answers, no. What it means is, it must mean that that we don't ein medaktin b'katan means that a child that he's grew pubic hairs, we aren't medaktik if he reached the age of 13 or not. We don't care because it's good enough if he has these 2 pubic hairs and doesn't need to be 13. We don't care to know if he's 13 or not. It doesn't matter. Now, this way of learning, it is a little surprising, and Tosfos is bothered with the way Rashi learns this. The reason he's bothered with it is because if you read the statement of the Brisa was at the bottom of the page, 47b. The reading of the Brisa is that a child that brought these 2 hairs, you do a zimun with him. If he didn't bring the 2 hairs, you don't do a zimun with him. And then it says, and we aren't careful with a child to know if he's 13 years old or not, right? Now that we know what it really means. The problem is, why is the Brisa saying that? We already said that he's a child and he brought 2 pubic hairs. Why would the Brisa, it's sort of repetitive? And Tosfos is bothered with that Tosfos brings Rashi and he says that Rashi translates this to mean that he's not 13 yet. And he says, why does it say to include this child who has, that it's teaching you that a child that grew these 2 pubic hairs, that he is included for the zimun. It says that clearly that he's included for the zimun on the same line, few words earlier. Now, what's it adding? That vein medaktikin b'katan. Why is it adding that a second time? And so therefore, Tosfos has a different way of learning the Gemara. And the way Tosfos learns the Gemara is that we're dealing with a child that is 13. The problem is we don't know if the hairs that he has, if they are large enough. So there's a measurement how long those hairs must be. They have to grow to the extent that you could fold them over in half. And so you have to, the Hebrew term for that is lakuf roishon leikron. You have to be able to bend the top of it, the outermost part to the root of it. And if you could bend it over, if it's a small hair, you wouldn't be able to bend it over. So that's how long the hairs must be. So what the Brisa says is that a katan, meaning a child that just reached the age of 13, and he brought these 2 hairs, you're mezamena on him. And if he didn't bring 2 hairs, you can't do a zimun. You don't do a zimun with him. He's not an adult. Ve'ein medaktikin b'katan, and we don't check the child to see if the measurement of the 2 hairs reach the measurement that they need to be. And that's what it means. In other words, it doesn't mean that we don't care if the child has the 2 hairs or not because he's 13 years old. That's good enough. Instead, no, it means we don't check to see if they reach the measurement. As long as he has the 2 hairs, that's good enough. And that's the way Tosfos understands it. And the only problem that Tosfos has is, now, how do you reconcile this with the previous Gemara that said that if there's a child who is mutal ba'arisa, if a child is a baby in a cradle, that you could count this baby for a zimun? Here we're making a whole big deal if the hairs are not large enough, the pubic hairs. What about the child? We said that the child you could join together. So the simple answer is, well, that was talking about when you have a zimun of 10, right? That's what we explained earlier, right? That's the Gemara explained that we're talking about a zimun of 10. You could make him counted for a zimun of 10, and here we're talking about 3. But Tosfos also says that it could be that this Brisa doesn't agree with that, and even for 10, maybe that Brisa, this Brisa won't agree that you could even include him for 10 because he really is considered a child, and we hold. In other words, Taisus is bothered with the fact that it seems like we're so strict on this child that he had not only he's 13 years old. We have to check, make sure that he has ears. Okay, we don't check that if the hairs are actually exact size, but at least we make sure that he has the pubic hairs and he's 13 years old. So Taisus is then bothered. What about the previous Gemara? So you could of course learn the simple explanation as the previous Gemara was talking about for a Zeman of 10. That for a Zeman of 10, maybe you could include this this baby who's definitely not 13 yet. He's a baby, and he's definitely doesn't have pubic hairs yet. And yet you could include him because it's just for a Zeman of 10. You already have a Zeman, just to enhance the Zeman to make it a Zeman of 10. But then the other thing that it says is it seems like maybe this brisa argues on that previous brisa, and that's the Taisus over here on the side. And anyway, that's the way the Gemara. So the two ways of learning the Gemara